Welcome back to Conversations for the Good. Hello, Dr. Jane.
Good morning, Anna. How are you?
I'm doing well. How about yourself?
I'm just fine, thanks. Good to be together again.
Yes, it is. And I'm very excited about today's conversation. We're adding another dimension to our conversation by discussing the self. So, to begin, I'm hoping that you can clarify several different self classifications like self image, self confidence, self esteem. There are so many variations.
Anna, there are, and this what this topic does is really kind of brings together the many parts that we've been discussing, but it highlights the self, and by doing that, we're really kind of bringing it all home to each of us because we want to shift from kind of abstract ideas and concepts to really having a direct experience with the information that we have. We've touched upon thinking and feeling and behavior and how these are formed starting with our socialization and early conditioning experiences. And also how kind of external events along the way, like prolonged stress or grief, have also been part of this conditioning. So we've also included some neuroscience in our discussions and how the brain is intimately involved in reactivity and the conditioning process. And the last time we talked about resilience, when we talked about it as being both an inherent process and also skills to be honed to help us deal with challenging times.
Yeah, well, there are certainly many dimensions along with such a variety of experiences layered in.
Exactly. So many dimensions, and yet all of these are part of the whole, what we call the self.
Like me, myself.
Yes. It's about who am I? Who am I?
Okay, who am I? What comes to my mind first is I'm a wife, a mom, daughter, female.
That's right. And usually we start with, and what comes up, as they did with you just now, kind of the obvious social roles, gender. These are the things that we think of in really kind of framing the self. These are descriptions that are easily shared. We don't care, who knows it, and people can, observe it almost automatically from just being with us or seeing us. And these are the pieces of the puzzle that identify who we are. They fall into a category known as the self concept, which is kind of the broad brushstroke of who we take ourselves to be. So to conceptualize is a thinking activity. So this is about thinking about who I am, the thinking of what it takes to really describe myself. And self concept, entails the full scope of self. So it's of course multidimensional. So it includes how we think about different aspects of ourselves, physical, mental, emotional aspects, even spiritual aspects. How we think about these aspects, but also how we feel about them. Do we approve of them? Do we judge them? And these concepts are not things that we're born with. They're learned. They're learned along the way in our development. And one of the early psychologists who talked about self-concept and self-esteem, spoke of this learning about ourselves as a developmental process, and he had kind of this, what we call a hierarchical structure. It's like you had to go up certain levels in order to achieve a sense of one's sense of self or self-esteem or being one's best, or what they called self-actualized self. And what he talked about was that if our basic needs, our basic biological needs, our basic security needs, our sense of belonging and connecting with others, if those needs are not met, we really cannot develop the higher self-esteem dimensions of ourselves. So the biological needs, the security needs, all need to be met early on. And this begins in early childhood. This is part of the childhood development that we've talked about with socialization, and really kind of takes us into early adulthood and then beyond that as well. And a lot of this tends to be pretty much solidified by the time we get into our adulthood, but it can be changed later in life. It's just more difficult because we have to kind of unlearn the conditioned responses. So the concept of self is influenced by biological, environmental, social interactions, factors like gender and race, our ethnicity, the geographical area that we're growing up in, social norms, customs, they're all part of the mix. And also there's this whole piece about attributes, you know, um, whether or not I perceive myself as being an introvert or an extrovert, whether I perceive myself as being kind of open and curious or kind of closed and withdrawn, whether or not I see myself as being generous or withholding. This plays into our personality. It plays into, how we perceive ourselves and the actions we take from this. And it also creates kind of a feedback loop. So it supports this process and changes this process and is always updating the process of self-concept. What's interesting is that self-concept isn't always aligned with reality, which I find very interesting because most of us can relate to a time maybe as early as the school playground when we realized that our families hadn't accurately depicted life situations and we found ourselves baffled by a new reality. It might be that it was, other people's mean behavior or someone coming to our aid when we were hurt or afraid.
So self-concept, if I'm understanding this correctly, is the big idea, which includes all of our history, our family's beliefs, our school and religious experiences, what our community and society has told us, and how we're treated as a boy and a girl, or a
That's
girl
right.
when we're young. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right, Anna. This is our backstory in action. We've talked about the backstory. It also includes how I feel about it, um, how I judge various parts of it, how it's tested out in the past, how it continues to test out in the real world, past, present, and future. So this represents our individual ideas of who we are and what we would like to become. And most of us work to maintain a positive evaluation of ourselves. Um, well, as best we can. We kind of distance ourselves from negative evaluations, and things that really kind of move us into that feeling negatively about ourselves, usually. And we feel better about ourselves if the negative evaluations are someplace in the past and positive evaluations are in the present or in the future. Because then we can kind of muster up this sense of control and confidence, and also accomplishment. We'll talk a little bit about that later. But to really discover the self-concept, we have to be willing um, to turn toward ourselves with the kindness and curiosity that we've talked about in our earlier conversations, and also some of the practices, like observing our thoughts, observing the difficulties, because we want to inquire into our attitudes and our opinions and also our reactions, and ask, where do these come from? Who said so? How does it fit into my life? What are the alternatives? But I don't want to get ahead of myself with this because there's more to say about the self-concept. As I just mentioned, the self-concept has multiple dimensions and it interacts with both our self-image and also our self-esteem.
Yeah, well, I'm happy you're going to individually kind of reveal the terms because it can be very confusing knowing the difference between self-concept, self-image, and self-esteem.
That's right. And then when we throw in, self-awareness and self-knowledge, because we need those to be able to assess and kind of unwrap and truly discover ourselves. Um, so we started with self-concept. This is the comprehensive individual view and evaluation of ourselves. And within this thinking schema, are more detailed patterns of thinking and behavior that kind of help us organize the information, kind of organize the influences and our relationship to it. And then it encodes it within us.
Wow. So we're going from the big picture and then zoom in on the details.
Yes, yeah. And so let's start with the self-image because this is a mental picture that we have of ourselves. And it really is it really is resistant to change. It's part of ourselves and part of how we perceive ourselves that really endures the long haul. The obvious components to a self-image would be my height, my weight, my hair color, but also aspects of ourselves that we learn through personal experiences, and also the judgment and judgments that we have of ourselves, both, that I have of myself or that others have kind of put on me. So there is a multitude of internalized attitudes and standards and opinions, and then there's also within the self concept, there's also what we call personal traits, things that we perceive as being part of us. Um, Things like, do I perceive myself as being smart or not so smart or hardworking or a slacker or a worrier or kind of easygoing or, giving or fearful. These are all statements that were made, usually by others or modeled by others non-verbally early on in an effort to tell us what was important and really kind of encourage us to use these personal traits to keep ourselves physically and socially safe. So statements like, um, we heard these in our homes, we don't associate with whatever type of people, they're just not like us, or don't eat such and such, or, you're just like your dad or your Aunt Joey or your Aunt Sue, you know. So we're hearing these and they become encoded kind of part of who we are and play out through our lives. Um, Social roles are also part of self-image, What's my social role? Am I a student? Am I a spouse? Am I a boss or a board member? These roles tend to dictate certain behaviors and certain expectations. All of this information and these influences are internalized and really kind of integrated into an identity, along with the question, am I living up to the expectations that are associated with these aspects? Their expectations. Am I being what I think I'm supposed to be? And they tend to fall into really kind of four subgroups. How we see ourselves, and then how we perceive that other people see us, and then how we perceive that the other people are seeing us. So let me go back to that. It's about how we see ourselves, and then how others see us. And then the third one is how I perceive that others see us. And then the fourth is how I integrate all of that into my own perception of self. And these are the traits that people usually define themselves.
Hmm. This is so interesting. I've never thought of self-image as being that microscopic view into our self-concept. There are so many details to consider here.
There really are. There really are. And let's move on to self-esteem, because this is our subjective evaluation of our self-worth. So this is how I'm evaluating that self-image. This is how I'm evaluating that and judging that. And when I say subjective, I mean that we're not being directed by outside influences, but relying on an internal sense of kind of the right thing to say or the right thing to do. So it tends to kind of move into that moral and ethical and sometimes even spiritual arena. It encompasses beliefs regarding myself, including all my perceptions, that we just itemized, in the self-image and the emotional states, like, do I experience a lot of angst or anxiety, pride, shame, or even despair? And all of this is incorporated into an overall sense of our personal value. So the self-esteem is really about what's important to me, what is of most value to me. This is our personal sense of worth, self-respect, value, our sense of self-integrity, our significance as a person, and this is part of what comes into play when I'm living in a commitment to be or to do my best, regardless of the outcome. It can predict outcomes such as academic achievement or happiness, marital satisfaction, success in relationships. Self-esteem can become an enduring, really a very enduring personal characteristic, what we call a trait. Or it can be kind of a short-term phenomena that we experience, and it's what we call a state. It can be a changeable component of ourselves.
This evaluation of ourselves is so important, Dr. Jane. Its origin is probably much like that of self-image, right?
Yes. The
Correct.
family of origin plays a significant role in the formulation of self-esteem because it's the main source of expectations and positive and negative appraisal depending on how those expectations are met. So basic early ingredients for healthy self-esteem, are being seen, being heard, being held in an environment of appropriate respect, attention, hopefully affection. And this is considered a healthy holding environment. It's significant in the first 4 years of life and really solidifies in the following years. It's also important that the child is recognized for accomplishments, no matter how small, and also not compared to others. The other piece that's incredibly significant is that mistakes and mishaps need to be dealt with guidance and acceptance. So this is important for motivation and also for success later in life. And most of us transition out of our childhood with a really kind of a solid sense of what it is to be a good boy or good girl, or the opposite, kind of that the dreaded admonishment of having bad manners or bad habits or disappointing our caregivers, failing to meet social standards.
I have a question. How does this show up as one matures?
Well, as we mature, self-esteem becomes less about what others say and more about an internal code of honor and integrity. So when we perceive, that we fail to live up to standards, or the influences of our social conditioning, it can lead to what we call either low self-esteem or unhealthy self-esteem. So the self-esteem lowers and very often kind of moves into this kind of frame of the dreaded self, so this increases, into, lower and lower perceptions of ourselves unless we are able to intervene in that process and really kind of lift ourselves out of it. So to maintain a healthy self-esteem, we need to remember that, first of all, it's an inside job. It's not wife esteem or husband esteem, or not friend esteem or job esteem. It really is keeping a few important essentials in mind that support it. Things like knowing what our values and our principles are and living by those, being secure enough to modify these, as they need to be changed throughout our life, and this is usually guided by our experiences. It's also, Anna, about, not dwelling in the past. It's about, extracting the lessons from our past and moving forward so that we can really begin to trust our capacity to solve problems and ask for help when we need it, look for mentors as we need mentors, and consider ourselves kind of equal in dignity to others, not better than or less than. And also be open to feedback from others. Sometimes people are able to kind of put the mirror up in front of us and say, this is what I see. Are you sure you want to be acting like this? And it's important that we're open to that because sometimes we have blind spots. It's also important to acknowledge our strengths, and along with that, to be compassionate to our own limitations and the limitations of others, and, if we need to remediate something, being open to doing that in order to be our best and highest self. And also, I can't stress enough the practices that we've talked about, the awareness skills, the self-compassion. These all help us maintain kind of really a clear insight into our thoughts and our feelings and our behaviors. And by doing this, we're also able to kind of peel that back and see what our motivations and our intentions are that come out of that.
Yeah. Wow. Well, yes, this is clearly a task for a lifetime. I'm just sitting here thinking about everything you just said. And, one day at a time. Oh my gosh. Doesn't this really highlight what we need to remember while we go through the long, I'm just thinking about all this while we're going through this long stress of this pandemic.
Oh, so true, Anna. You just kind of really nailed it. Because once I increase my awareness of my self-image, my self-esteem, then I can compare it to my ideal self. This is how I wish I was or how I'd like to be, and so many of us have felt that we've come up short in this pandemic because we've been, in this prolonged stress. So it's really about looking at, am I living up to my personal and highest self? Am I really engaging in that on a regular basis? Um, and this is, as I say, it's shaped by early experiences, the original influences of our family and our school, our church, but also our personal experiences. And we're all having, a huge shift in our personal experiences with this pandemic. So I want to be able to tune into what are the messages that I'm getting from my social circle, my, the cultural values, what are the people that I deem important? What do they have to say about dealing with difficult times? And am I experiencing consistency, or do I feel like I'm kind of in a mismatch? Um, do I like where I am right now? Am I living up to what I believe is my best and highest self? And this affects how we value ourselves, the self-esteem, and also our relationship to our self-image. The ideal self that's realistically defined and realized can support a positive view and appreciation of ourselves. And we become more secure in ourselves and less vulnerable, or at least able to be with our vulnerability, and less vulnerable to outside criticism, less demanding of feedback. Um, and I want to say feedback that doesn't really doesn't support us being our best, because the feedback that we want is feedback that really supports my self-esteem, supports my integrity, supports my value. I don't need it from the outside necessarily to bolster my self-worth. I also want to be less defensive and less reactive. When others question me about what I'm doing, I want to be able to stand firm in what my decisions are.
This is such an important piece. So where does self-confidence come into the picture?
Well, I think of self-efficacy and also self-confidence as kind of being the two sides of the same coin. Self-efficacy is a realistic appraisal of what I think I can control and how well I believe I can handle future actions and performances. So we have to have the ability to pull it off, no matter what it is. And do I believe that I have that ability to pull it off? And self-confidence is a trust. It's trusting that we can or can't get something accomplished. It's about the willingness to take on the challenges. Can I do this or not? And the responsibilities, include with this confidence, includes the responsibilities for making these decisions. And when I make the decision out of the trust that I can do this, there's really kind of a standing firm with it, and our confidence inspires the experience, even though I might experience failures. It's kind of like bring it on with the intention that I'll learn from this. I'll try harder. I'll accumulate more skills and in the expertise to meet the expectations next time. I'm committed to succeeding at this.
Dr. Jane, where does one start to explore like the components of self-concept, self-image, self-esteem?
Well, Anna, really, we've already started that process. We've been honing our awareness skills since our early conversations, by tuning into ourselves, by observing our thoughts and feelings and the body sensations. We're more adept at sensing when we're on that train that runs 24/7, that mind that kind of whirls with the autopilot thinking. We know when we're on the train, we know when we're off the train just by doing those practices. And with this foundation, we can inquire into the dimensions of self and really begin to explore their beginnings. Can I kind of track some of our socialization, our conditioning via memories? It's kind of like allowing ourselves to inquire into it and kind of pulling up that chain of content through our memories of, oh yeah, that's where it started. Oh yeah, that's just like my dad used to say, or my mom, or my neighbor, or whomever. It's important to approach this though with kindness and curiosity, because there's bound to be reactivity that's going to bubble up or sometimes actually explode. And that's when we go to our breath, moving our focus to the non-thinking, non-conceptual, kind of being with the reactivity, breathing into it, notice where it is in my body, allowing that to kind of soothe me and anchor me, and then re-engaging in my inquiry when I found my anchor. So we're inquiring, we're wondering, what is this about? What's this? Where did this start? How is it that I'm at this place where this feels so right today? And sometimes we can explore our lives kind of in chapters or age segments. It doesn't all need to be inquired into in one sitting. I've had people write their autobiography, to begin with, just to inquire into their backstory, which feeds the self-concept, which feeds the self-image and the self-esteem. Questions that can be asked of ourselves, including things like, what did my family, church, school, community, where I grew up, that geographical area, tell me about what it was to be a good boy, a good girl, a good woman, a good man, and also take a look at who modeled that. Who was I allowed to associate with, and who was excluded, and what were the reasons, when did I feel special, or with whom did I feel special, and what was considered success? The other piece that's important is, how are mistakes handled? How are my mistakes, my mishaps, or real big bungles handled? What was expected of me, and did I comply? Was I able to meet others' expectations and eventually my own expectations? And also, what did my family, my school, my religion tell me about what it was to be healthy? What did they tell me about education or money or sex or people who were different from me? That's really the place that we can start.
This is a start for sure. That's why this is called our life work, right?
That's exactly right. That's exactly
I see a lot of triggers there, Dr. Jane.
Yes.
And with that being said, our next conversation is about how we sabotage ourselves. Dr. Jane, can you give us a little insight?
Well, yes, Anna. What we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the inner critic and the inner judge and really begin to kind of tease out how, in an effort to keep us safe, it can sometimes undermine our efforts to be our best and highest self. It can undermine our self-esteem.
Yeah, well, this has been a very enlightening conversation, and I'm really looking forward to taking a look at my inner critic. Thank you so much, and we'll talk next week. I'm looking forward to it, Dr. Jane.
Thank you, Anna. Take good care.